Welcome back to Crime Time, Inc. This case is straight out of Tom's true crime quiz book.
It really is.
Yeah.
This Jörg Jenatsch, Swiss political leader, intrigue, violence, assassination. Where do we even start with a story like this?
Well, you sent over historical accounts,
yeah,
witness testimonies, forensic reports, facial reconstruction.
Yeah.
Let's unpack this.
Let's unpack it.
For our listener,
Okay.
the story takes place during the 30 Years' War.
All right.
So we've got religion and politics mixed up with murder. It all goes down in the Grisons,
Yes.
which is a strategically vital region in Switzerland. Back then, it was caught in a power struggle between major European players.
Absolutely. And right in the thick of it is Jörg Jenatsch.
Okay.
What's fascinating is he wasn't always a political player.
Well,
He started as a Protestant pastor. Can you imagine a pastor turning into this key figure?
in such a chaotic and violent period.
Okay, so how did this man of the cloth
Right.
end up embroiled in such a web of intrigue? This isn't exactly Sunday school material.
No, it's not. It's
Okay.
really not. The Grisons at that time was a hotbed of tension,
Okay.
split between the Protestant and the pro-Spanish Catholic faction.
Yeah.
Both sides were constantly vying for control.
Right.
And then in 1621, Jenatsch gets involved in a pivotal event, the murder of Pompeius von Planta,
Okay.
who led the opposing Catholic faction.
Okay, hold on. Jenatsch, the pastor, was involved in a murder.
Yes,
This is where it gets really interesting.
it does.
Okay.
Now, the historical records aren't crystal clear on whether he delivered the fatal blow,
Right.
but he was definitely part of the group that stormed Planta's castle in Rietberg. According to eyewitness accounts, they pinned Planta to the floor with an axe.
An axe.
Yeah.
Wow. Talk about a brutal scene. So this act pretty much sealed Jenatsch's fate, right? Forced him down a darker path.
Precisely. He was stripped of his pastoral position, forced into exile.
Right.
It basically launched his career as a soldier of fortune.
So he traded his robes for armor
Yes.
and his sermons for battle cries. What was his military career like?
Well, he was surprisingly skilled, rising through the ranks quickly. He even led troops for major players like Venice and France.
Switching sides like that makes you wonder about his loyalties, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Is it all strategy?
It makes you wonder, was he a true believer
Right.
in any of the causes he fought for?
Yeah.
That's a question historians are still debating today.
Yeah.
And it's a key piece of the puzzle for our listener, too.
Right.
We see this political maneuvering throughout his life. He was always adapting to the political climate, forming and breaking alliances as needed,
Right.
which begs the question, was this a man driven by conviction
Right.
or just ambition?
He sounds like a master chess player.
He does, moving people and allegiances around the board to his advantage.
Oh.
But there's this other massive twist in his story, isn't there? His conversion to Catholicism.
You're right. In 1635, after years of being a staunch Protestant, Jenatsch converts to Catholicism, shocking everyone.
That's a pretty dramatic shift.
It is.
What could have prompted such a drastic change of heart?
Well,
Was he really swayed, or was it another calculated power move?
he claimed that reading the writings of early church leaders during a stint in a Venetian prison changed his views.
Okay.
But on the flip side,
Yeah.
he also becomes a leader of the Kettenbund,
Okay.
a secret alliance aimed at driving the French out of the Gruesome.
Uh-huh.
And this alliance included some of his former enemies.
Talk about burying the hatchet, literally. So he teams up with his old rivals to pursue a common goal. It seems like his personal beliefs always took a backseat to his political ambitions.
It seems that way.
And it all culminates in that fateful night during Carnival, doesn't it?
You're talking about his assassination, of course. On January 24th, 1639,
Right.
while everyone else was celebrating Carnival and Sure,
Yeah.
Jenatsch met a rather grim end.
So let's talk about the details of his death.
Okay.
This is where the true crime element really kicks in.
All right.
What do we know about how it went down?
Well, picture this. Jenatsch is out and about during the Carnival festivities,
Okay.
and a group of masked men, one disguised as a bear,
A bear.
yes,
Yeah.
confront him. This wasn't some random street brawl.
Right.
This was targeted.
Okay. What happened next?
The reports say that one of the attackers pulled out a pistol and fired, but he either missed completely
Right.
or only grazed Jenatsch. Before he could react, another attacker lunged at him, swinging an axe.
An axe again. This was clearly a personal attack.
Absolutely.
Right.
And to make sure that he was dead,
Right.
the other attackers started pounding his head and body with a riding hammer.
This is where things get pretty graphic. I mean, a riding hammer? That's brutal. So they really wanted to make sure he was gone.
No doubt about it.
Yeah.
This wasn't just about silencing him. It was about revenge.
Do we know who these masked assailants were? I mean, somebody had to recognize them, right?
You'd think so, especially during Carnival, but the assassins were never officially identified. Suspicion fell on Rudolf von Planta, the son of Pompeius.
Right.
The man Jenatsch was involved in killing all those years ago.
The classic revenge scenario. That makes sense. But did they ever pin it on Rudolf?
No, they never caught the assassins.
Really?
And although Rudolf was the prime suspect, there are other theories floating around. Some historians even suggest that Pompeius's daughter, Katharina von Planta, might have been involved.
Wow.
However, there's nothing concrete to support that theory.
So this is where the historical record gets a little murky. We've got a murder, a prime suspect, and a bunch of loose ends. But then centuries later, there's this incredible discovery in the Church Cathedral.
Right. In 1959, during renovations,
they found a skeleton buried beneath the cathedral floor. The location, the remnants of expensive clothing, and the injuries to the skull, they all pointed to one person, Jörg Jenatsch.
This is like something out of a history book.
I know.
Wait, but how did they know for sure it was him after all that time?
That's where the science comes in. Remember, this is the 20th century now.
Yeah.
So we have tools that those 17th century folks could only dream of.
Okay.
Scientists were able to extract DNA from the skeleton.
Wow.
And compare it to samples from living descendants of Jenatsch's family.
Hold on. They found his relatives after all these years.
Yes.
That's incredible.
It was quite a feat. And the DNA analysis, despite some minor discrepancies in specific markers, indicated a very strong likelihood that the skeleton was indeed that of Jörg Jenatsch.
So science provided a way to reach back through time and confirm his identity. What a twist.
It really is.
And it opened up a whole new avenue for understanding not only Jenatsch's death, but his life as well.
Right.
With the skeleton discovered, researchers were able to go beyond the historical accounts and analyze his remains. They used a technique called stable isotope analysis, which revealed fascinating details about his diet.
Isotopes? That sounds complicated.
It does.
Can you break it down for our listener?
Yeah.
What exactly can we learn about someone from their isotope?
It's actually pretty straightforward. Imagine isotopes as tiny chemical signatures left behind by the food we eat and the water we drink. They become locked into our bones and teeth, essentially creating a record of what we consumed.
So it's like a food diary written in the language of chemistry.
Exactly.
That's so cool.
And in Jenatsch's case, they found high levels of nitrogen isotopes, which indicated he ate a lot of meat and dairy. This pointed to a pretty wealthy lifestyle, much different from his humble beginnings as a pastor.
From pastor to political mastermind, with a taste for the finer things in life. This guy's life is full of surprises. We've covered a lot of ground so far, from Jenatsch's early life as a pastor to his controversial political career and his brutal murder. And then centuries later, we have this incredible discovery of his remains and the scientific investigation that followed. What a story.
And we've only just begun to scratch the surface. There's so much more to uncover about Jenatsch, his motivations, and the mysteries surrounding his life and death.
That's awesome.
Yeah. You know, this whole case is like a puzzle with pieces scattered across centuries. We've got these historical accounts, witness testimonies, and then bam, modern science throws in a whole new set of pieces.
And those modern forensic techniques are key to understanding the finer details of his assassination. We were talking about how brutal it was. But the analysis of his skull really brings that night into focus.
Exactly. Remember how those historical accounts described him being struck with an axe, then finished off with a riding hammer?
Yeah, it was pretty gruesome.
Well, the forensic team was able to examine the skull injuries closely. They found a large circular fracture on the right side of his head. It's consistent with a blow from a heavy blunt object, like a hammer.
So that lines up with what those witnesses reported.
It does. But there's another injury that's even more telling. A deep, wedge-shaped notch on the left side of his skull right on the temple.
And that's consistent with the axe.
Precisely. And the way that notch is angled suggests the blow came from behind.
Okay.
Maybe while Jenatsch was still standing, or maybe just as he was falling. Imagine that scene.
Yeah.
The chaos of the carnival, the masked attackers, and then that sudden fatal blow from behind.
It's like a scene from a nightmare.
I know.
This was a carefully orchestrated attack. They knew what they were doing.
Yeah.
And they wanted him dead.
No question about it. But going back to the forensic analysis, remember those isotopes we talked about? The ones that revealed his luxurious diet later in life?
Yeah, the high levels of nitrogen.
Right.
Indicating all that meat and dairy.
Well, there's more to that story.
Okay.
The researchers were able to identify a variety of plants in his diet, including C3 plants, typical wheat and barley.
Right.
But they also found traces of millet.
Okay. What's so interesting about millet?
Think of it this way. In Jenatsch's time, millet was like the ramen noodles of the 17th century. It was a cheap, filling grain, typically eaten by the poor.
Okay.
Not exactly something you'd find on the table of a wealthy political figure.
So what does that tell us? Was he secretly struggling financially, despite the lavish lifestyle he was projecting?
That's one possibility. Or perhaps it reflects his upbringing, a reminder of those early years as a simple pastor, before he climbed the ladder of power.
It's like a hidden chapter in his biography.
Right.
Revealed through the tiniest clues left behind in his bones.
Yeah.
It really makes you wonder, doesn't it?
It does.
What other secrets might be hiding within those isotopes?
I'm glad you brought that up because it connects to a larger point about Jenatsch's legacy.
Okay.
Today, in Switzerland, he's still a highly debated figure. Some see him as a cunning opportunist, always playing both sides to advance his own interests.
Kind of like how he switched from Protestant to Catholic. And don't forget all those shifting political alliances.
Yeah.
It's easy to see why some people might view him that way.
Right. But others see him as a fierce defender of his homeland.
Okay.
They argue that his actions, however morally ambiguous, were ultimately aimed at protecting the Grisons' independence.
Right. So he's like a Swiss Machiavelli.
Yeah.
A man willing to do whatever it takes to achieve his goals, even if it means bending the rules or sacrificing his principles.
There's definitely an element of that to his personality.
Yeah.
He was a master of strategy and manipulation, always thinking a few steps ahead of his rivals.
Speaking of strategy, let's not forget about all those travels we discussed earlier.
Oh, yeah.
Remember how the analysis of his remains provided those clues about his movements across Europe?
Right. The strontium and lead isotope analysis was particularly insightful.
Yeah.
These isotopes act like a geographical fingerprint, revealing where a person lived at different points in their life.
So they're like breadcrumbs scattered across the map of his life.
Exactly. And in Jenatsch's case, the analysis showed significant variations in these isotopes between his tooth enamel, which forms in childhood, and his dentin, which forms later in life.
Which means he wasn't exactly a homebody.
No, he was not.
It makes sense, though, given his time in the Engadine, Zurich, Basel, and then all over Europe as a soldier for Venice and France.
Yes.
It's like those isotopes painted a map of his adventures.
They did, and it's through this kind of scientific detective work that we can begin to fill in the blanks and build a more complete picture of Jenatsch's life.
We've been focusing on his public life, his political and military exploits.
Yes.
But what about his personal life? Did he have a family? And if so,
he did.
How did they factor into all of this chaos?
That's a great question.
Yeah.
And it adds another layer to the whole story. You see, while Jörg Jenatsch converted to Catholicism in 1635, his family remained Protestant.
Wow. So even within his own family, there was this division along religious lines. Can you imagine the tension at family gatherings?
It must have been incredibly difficult for them.
Yeah.
It was a time when religious beliefs were deeply intertwined with politics and identity.
Right, making choices like that.
That could have serious consequences, even within families. Imagine those conversations.
Yes.
Those debates.
Wow.
It adds a whole new dimension to Jenatsch's story, doesn't it?
It really does.
Yeah.
It reminds us that behind the grand narratives of history, there were real people grappling with these decisions and the personal costs of taking a stand.
We've talked about the skull, the isotopes, those historical accounts, but was there any other physical evidence found with his remains? Anything from the night of the assassination?
You're thinking like a true detective. And yes, when they first exhumed his skeleton back in 1959, they found something quite remarkable. Tufts of hair. Brownish black hair, described as being soaked in blood.
Oh, wow.
It's almost like holding a piece of that night in your hand, but they lost it. Sometime after the initial exhumation, the hair sample disappeared.
Oh, that's too bad.
Can you imagine what they could do with that hair today, with all the DNA technology we have?
It's a missed opportunity.
Yeah.
But even without the hair, we still have one crucial piece of evidence that helped confirm Jenatsch's identity. The portrait.
Right.
That was painted just a few years before his death.
Right, the portrait. It was a pretty good likeness, if I remember correctly. How did that help with the identification?
Well, the forensic team created a facial reconstruction using his skull, and then they compared it to the portrait.
Did it match?
It was uncanny.
Wow.
The shape of his face, the placement of his eyes, nose, and mouth, they all lined up almost perfectly with the portrait.
That's awesome.
It was like looking at a mirror image, separated by centuries.
It's incredible how art and science can come together to solve mysteries like this. And speaking of mysteries, this whole story is full of them. We've pieced together a lot of his life.
Yeah.
The travels, the betrayals, the murders. We even have his diet mapped out.
Right.
But the biggest question remains.
Yeah.
Why?
That's right.
What drove this man? What were his true motivations?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Was it ambition? Patriotism?
Yeah.
Revenge?
Was he a cold, calculating manipulator?
Right.
Or was there something more to him?
Yeah.
Did he believe in the causes he fought for?
Right.
Or was it all just a game of power?
And then there's his conversion to Catholicism.
Yes.
Was it a genuine change of heart or just another strategic maneuver?
It's a puzzle that historians are still trying to solve.
Yeah.
The answers might be buried somewhere in those historical archives.
Right.
Or maybe they're lost forever, like that lock of hair.
I guess some mysteries are meant to remain unsolved.
Right.
But that's what makes history so fascinating, isn't it? The challenge of trying to understand the past, knowing that we might never have all the answers.
I couldn't agree more. And in Jenatsch's case, the lack of clear answers only adds to his mystique. He remains an enigma, a figure who continues to intrigue and challenge us centuries after his death.
We've talked a lot about Jenatsch's life, his death, and the scientific investigation that brought him back into the spotlight.
Yeah.
But his story isn't just about him, is it?
What do you mean?
Well, his life was so intertwined with the major events of his time.
Yes.
The 30 Years' War, the religious conflicts, the political power struggles. His story is a window into a world on the brink.
Yeah.
A world where allegiances were fluid and violence was often the answer.
You're right. He wasn't just a participant in these events. He was a product of them.
Right.
And by understanding his story, we can gain a deeper understanding of the forces that shaped not just his life, but the course of history itself.
And maybe, just maybe, by exploring the complexities of a figure like Jenatsch, we can learn something about our own world, our own struggles with power, ambition, and the choices we make in the face of conflict. It makes you think, doesn't it?
It certainly does. It's a reminder that history isn't just a collection of dates and battles. It's a tapestry woven from the lives of individuals, each with their own story to tell, their own mysteries to unravel.
That's a good point.
And sometimes those individual stories can shed light on the grand narratives of history in ways we never expected.
It's amazing how we can find these connections across time. Jenatsch's life, though brutal in many ways, can still resonate with us today.
Absolutely. It's a testament to the power of storytelling.
Yeah.
The way that even the darkest chapters of the past can illuminate the human condition and offer insights into the timeless questions that continue to haunt us. You know, even centuries after his death, Jenatsch was still stirring up controversy.
You mean with the whole debate about whether that skeleton they found in the church cathedral was actually him?
Exactly. Remember when they unearthed that skeleton back in 1959?
Yeah.
From the get-go, there were skeptics. Some argued that the skull injuries didn't quite match up with the historical accounts of the assassination. Others questioned if the fancy clothes found with the remains really belonged to someone of Jenatsch's stature.
So there was a disconnect between the physical evidence and what history told us.
That's right. And it fueled all sorts of speculation for decades.
Wow.
Some folks even went so far as to suggest the body had been moved at some point.
Really?
Or that the whole discovery was an elaborate hoax.
A hoax. People really went there. So how did they finally settle the debate and prove it was really Jenatsch?
It took a mix of modern science and some good old-fashioned detective work.
Okay.
The DNA analysis we talked about definitely played a big part, but it was the facial reconstruction that really clinched it.
You mentioned that before. How did that work exactly?
Forensic artists used Jenatsch's skull to recreate his facial features. They were able to get incredibly specific, even down to the shape of his nose and a slight asymmetry in his jawline. Then they compared the reconstruction to his portrait. And it was practically a perfect match. When they overlaid the two images, it was like looking at identical twins.
Wow, that must have shut down the skeptics pretty quickly.
Yeah, it did.
It's amazing to me how science can bridge the gap between centuries and help solve historical mysteries.
It really is. And it opens up a whole new way of looking at the past.
So after all the investigations, the analysis, the debates, what's the takeaway here? What can we truly say about Jörg Jenatsch?
He was a man of contradictions. A pastor turned soldier.
Right.
A Protestant turned Catholic. A master of playing both sides. He was ruthless, cunning, capable of both great violence and shrewd political maneuvering.
He sounds like a character straight out of a Shakespearean tragedy.
He really does. And his life perfectly mirrors the turbulence of the 30 Years' War, a time of religious strife and political upheaval.
Right.
He was a product of his time, yet he also shaped it in his own unique way.
Is there anything about Jenatsch that really stands out to you? Any lingering questions or mysteries that you'd like to see explored further?
What intrigues me most is that despite everything we know about his actions, we may never truly understand his motivations.
Right.
What were his core beliefs?
Yeah.
Was he driven by a desire for power, a love for his homeland, or something else entirely?
And what about his conversion to Catholicism?
Right.
Was it genuine, or was it just another play in his game of power? I guess those are questions that may never have definitive answers.
You're right. Some mysteries are meant to remain unsolved.
Well, I think we've covered just about everything on Jörg Jenatsch. We've explored his life and death, analyzed the evidence, and maybe even raised more questions than we've answered. What a wild ride through history this has been.
It has been fascinating.
Simon and Tom will discuss all of this week's cases tomorrow in their weekly review show. Meantime, we'll be back on Monday for another great true crime episode.